certain memories return without permission. Not the important ones, just the ones that feel slightly unfinished. Strange thing is, your mind ignores what's complete and keeps circling what never settled. And the more you try to leave them behind, the more they behave like something that was never meant to end. Your mind doesn't preserve moments equally, even though it feels like it should. What stays with you isn't always what was most important or most emotional or even most meaningful at the time. What remains active tends to be something far less obvious, moments that never fully reached a conclusion inside your awareness. A conversation can end, an event can pass, a situation can dissolve in real life. But internally, if your understanding of it lagged behind the experience itself, the process never actually closed. That delay matters more than people think, because the mind doesn't treat experience as complete simply because time has moved forward. It waits for a certain kind of internal resolution. Not a dramatic one, not even a satisfying one, just a moment where perception, emotion, and meaning align at the same time. And when that alignment fails to happen in real time, the experience remains open in a subtle way, almost like something that continues running quietly beneath everything else. That's why certain memories return without warning. Not because they were the most intense, but because they never reached that internal point of completion. You were physically present when they happened, but mentally something arrived too late. The understanding, the clarity, the awareness of what the moment actually was. And by the time that awareness formed, the moment itself had already disappeared, leaving behind a kind of unfinished structure in your mind. Silence exposes this more clearly than anything else. When nothing is actively demanding your attention, when your environment stops feeding you new input, the mind shifts toward whatever remains unresolved. It doesn't do this aggressively or with intention. It simply drifts back to what never settled, not as a choice, but as a continuation of something that was never fully processed in the first place. And what keeps returning isn't really the event itself, even though it feels that way. What you're experiencing is the gap between the moment as it happened and your ability to fully understand it while it was happening. That gap becomes the center of the loop, because now, in the present, you have access to a level of awareness that didn't exist back then. You can see what it meant. You can recognize what should have been said, what could have been done, how things might have unfolded differently. So your mind runs the moment again, not to relive it, but to simulate a version of yourself that matches this newer awareness. And for a brief second, it feels almost complete, almost resolved, as if the missing piece has finally been inserted. But that feeling never holds, because the context is gone. The timing is gone. The version of you that existed in that moment no longer exists either. So the simulation never becomes real resolution, and the loop continues without ever fully closing. And even that doesn't explain everything, because some memories remain active long after they've been fully understood, long after every angle has been considered and every interpretation has been explored. At that point, the replay stops being about the event itself and begins shifting towards something much less visible, something tied more closely to how you see yourself than what actually happened. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. At a certain point, the memory stops functioning as a recollection and starts behaving more like a mirror. The focus shifts away from the situation and moves toward the version of you that existed inside it. And that's where the tone of the replay changes, because now it's no longer about understanding what happened. It's about evaluating who you were when it did. This is where the discomfort sharpens, even if nothing dramatic occurred in the original moment. You begin to notice details that didn't seem significant at the time. The hesitation in your voice, the silence where a response could have existed, the way you allowed something to continue longer than it should have. These aren't extreme failures. They're subtle mismatches between how you acted then and how you believe you would act now. And that mismatch creates a quiet tension that doesn't resolve easily. Not because it's overwhelming, but because it feels inaccurate. It introduces a version of yourself that no longer fits your current sense of identity, and your mind doesn't ignore that kind of inconsistency. Instead, it returns to the moment, not searching for new information, but measuring the distance between who you were and who you believe you are now. This comparison becomes the real source of repetition, because the brain prefers continuity, a stable, consistent narrative of self across time. When a memory disrupts that narrative, it doesn't get filed away like everything else. It stays active, not as a memory of the past, but as a point of contradiction that hasn't been resolved. So the mind begins to adjust the experience, not by changing what happened, but by imagining how it could have unfolded differently. Different words, different timing, different reactions. These imagined variations aren't attempts to rewrite reality, but attempts to temporarily align the past version of yourself with your current expectations. And for a moment, that alignment feels cleaner, more accurate, more controlled. But it doesn't last, because the mind recognizes, even if only subtly, that this version never actually existed. The correction remains hypothetical, and the original contradiction stays intact. So the process repeats, not out of habit, but out of an ongoing attempt to resolve something that cannot be resolved in the way the mind prefers. At that point, the replay stops resembling memory altogether and starts behaving like a form of control. Not control over the past, but control over how the past fits into your identity. And the more that control is attempted, the more persistent the memory becomes, not louder, not more emotional, just consistently present in the background. Letting it go would require something different, something less intuitive. It would require allowing that version of yourself to exist without correction, without adjustment, without forcing it to match who you are now. And that creates a different kind of discomfort, one that feels less active, but more permanent. So, instead, the mind continues the loop, because repetition still feels like movement, even when nothing actually changes. And underneath all of this, a deeper conflict begins to form, not about the memory itself, and not even about the actions within it, but about the standard you hold yourself to across time, and whether every version of you is allowed to exist, or only the ones that meet your current expectations. At some point, the repetition stops feeling accidental. It begins to feel selective, almost intentional, even though it isn't. Out of thousands of moments you've lived through, only a few keep returning with this level of persistence, and what they have in common isn't always obvious at first. They aren't always the worst things that happen to you, and they aren't always tied to visible mistakes. What they share is something quieter, a moment where your internal standard was quietly violated, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that stayed unnoticed until later. That delay creates a specific kind of discomfort, because by the time you recognize it, the situation is already gone. You can see the misalignment clearly now, but you couldn't see it when it mattered. And that realization doesn't come with resolution. It comes with a subtle form of self-observation that doesn't turn off easily. You begin watching yourself from a distance, not just in that memory, but across other situations too, measuring reactions, responses, silences, trying to detect whether the same pattern still exists. But that's not the real problem. The real problem begins when the mind stops treating the memory as something to understand and starts using it as evidence. Evidence of inconsistency, evidence that your perception of yourself might not be as stable as it feels. And once a memory becomes evidence, it no longer fades naturally. It gets referenced. It gets revisited, not for clarity, but for confirmation. This is where something subtle shifts. Instead of asking, "What happened?" your mind starts asking, "What does this say about me?" And that question doesn't have a clean answer, because identity isn't fixed. It changes across time, across context, across awareness. But the mind doesn't like that kind of fluidity. It prefers something more defined, something that can remain consistent across different moments. So when a memory introduces a version of you that contradicts that consistency, it doesn't get accepted as part of the whole. It gets isolated, it gets examined, and it stays active, not because it's unresolved in the usual sense, but because it challenges the structure you use to understand yourself. That's why the loop doesn't feel emotional in the way people expect. It doesn't always come with strong feelings or visible distress. Sometimes it's almost neutral, just a quiet return to the same scene, the same details, the same version of you that doesn't quite fit. And that neutrality makes it harder to notice what's actually happening, because it doesn't feel urgent, even though it is persistent. But the deeper issue isn't the memory itself, it's the standard behind it, the expectation that every version of you should have known better, should have reacted differently, should have aligned with the awareness you have now. And that expectation doesn't leave room for context. It ignores the fact that awareness develops over time, that perception changes, that understanding is always delayed to some degree. Instead, it applies the present standard to a past version of you and treats the difference as a flaw. And that's where the tension becomes continuous. Because now, every time the memory returns, it's not just showing you what happened. It's quietly reinforcing the idea that something about you was not enough in that moment. Not enough awareness, not enough clarity, not enough control. And even if you don't consciously believe that, the repetition keeps the implication active. But that still isn't the deepest layer of the problem. Because the memory isn't just being replayed, it's being protected. And that changes everything. Letting the memory fade would seem like the natural outcome. Understanding has already happened. The situation is over. Nothing can be changed. From a logical standpoint, the loop should end on its own, but it doesn't, and the reason has nothing to do with the event itself. The loop continues because the memory serves a function that isn't immediately visible. It holds a version of you in place, not because you want to revisit it, but because removing it would create a gap in how you understand your own development. That version of you, the one that didn't meet your current expectations, becomes a fixed reference point. It represents something you've moved away from, something you no longer identify with. And as long as it stays active, it gives you a sense of direction, a sense of distance from who you used to be. But that creates a quiet dependency, because now the memory isn't just something you experienced, it becomes something you use. A way to define improvement, a way to measure growth, a way to confirm that you are no longer that person. And without it, that contrast disappears. The clarity it provides about who you are now begins to blur. So the mind holds onto it, not out of attachment to the past, but out of attachment to the structure it creates. This is why certain memories don't soften over time. They remain sharp, not because they're unresolved, but because they're still being used as a reference. And every time they return, they reinforce the same internal distinction between who you were then and who you believe you are now. But this creates another problem. Because as long as that distinction remains active, so does the underlying comparison. And comparison, even when it feels subtle, keeps the past version of you in a constant position of judgment. It doesn't allow that version to exist as it was. It keeps trying to reinterpret it through a newer lens, one that wasn't available at the time. That reinterpretation never stabilizes. It keeps shifting as your awareness evolves, which means the memory never reaches a final form. It stays open, not because it lacks understanding, but because the standard you're applying to it keeps changing. And that leads to something even more difficult to notice. You begin to treat your past self as something that needs correction, rather than something that already existed within a different level of awareness. That mindset doesn't just apply to one memory, it extends outward, affecting how you relate to other moments, other versions of yourself, even present situations that haven't fully unfolded yet. Because now, every experience carries an implicit expectation that it should be handled with the highest level of awareness you currently possess. And when that doesn't happen, even in small ways, the same pattern begins again. The delay in understanding, the return of the memory, the comparison, the quiet attempt to adjust something after the fact. It becomes a cycle that reinforces itself. Not because you're stuck in the past, but because your relationship with your own timeline has become conditional. Only the versions of you that meet your current expectations are allowed to feel complete. Everything else stays open, subject to review, subject to revision. And that's why the mind doesn't rest. Not because it enjoys repetition, but because it hasn't been given permission to let certain versions of you exist without being re-evaluated. And that creates a constant internal motion that doesn't depend on external events. It continues, even in stillness. It continues, even when nothing new is happening. Because the conflict is no longer tied to the memory itself. It's tied to the way you relate to every version of yourself across time, and the quiet refusal to let any of them remain exactly as they were. The loop doesn't break by forcing the memory to disappear. That approach only adds pressure, and pressure keeps the process active. What shifts it is something less aggressive, a change in how the memory is being used. Right now, the memory is being treated as something that needs correction. Every replay carries a quiet intention to refine it, to adjust the response, to align it with who you are now. That intention feels subtle, but it keeps the experience open because correction implies that something is still incomplete. What happens instead if the memory is no longer approached as something that needs to be improved, not ignored, not suppressed, just removed from the need to be fixed? That shift sounds simple, but it changes the entire structure of the loop. Because the moment the mind stops trying to adjust the past, it loses the reason to keep returning to it in the same way. The replay no longer serves a function. It becomes just a record, not a task. But the difficulty isn't in understanding this. The difficulty is in allowing a version of yourself to exist without modification. That's where resistance appears. Because accepting that version doesn't feel neutral. It feels like lowering a standard. It feels like allowing something incorrect to remain as it is. And the mind instinctively moves against that because it prefers precision, consistency, alignment. But what most people don't realize is that acceptance in this context isn't approval. It doesn't mean agreeing with how you acted. It doesn't mean pretending it was the best response. It means recognizing that your awareness at that time had limits, and those limits were real. No amount of replay changes that. So instead of approaching the memory as something to revisit, it can be approached as something to observe without involvement, not analyzing it, not adjusting it, not inserting new responses into it, just seeing it as it was, with the understanding that it already belongs to a different version of you. That creates distance, not emotional distance in the usual sense, but structural distance. The memory stops being something active and becomes something placed. It no longer sits in the present, waiting for correction. It moves into the past, where it actually belongs. And when that placement becomes stable, the urgency fades. Not instantly, not completely, but gradually the need to return to it weakens, because the mind is no longer being asked to do anything with it. And that changes the relationship. The memory stops feeling like an open process and starts feeling like a closed one, not because it was resolved in the way the mind originally wanted, but because it's no longer being treated as something unfinished. But that shift only holds if something else changes alongside it, because the loop isn't only about the past, it's also about what you expect from yourself now. The same mechanism that keeps old memories active doesn't stay in the past. It quietly shapes how you move through current moments, setting an expectation that every response should match your highest level of awareness. And that expectation creates a constant tension, because awareness is never perfectly timed. It always arrives slightly after the moment, never fully inside it. So if the standard remains rigid, the pattern continues. Moments happen. Understanding arrives later. The gap forms. The loop begins again. Breaking that pattern doesn't require lowering awareness. It requires changing what you do with the delay. Instead of treating delayed understanding as a flaw, it can be treated as a natural part of perception. You respond with what you know at the time. The rest becomes clear later. That sequence isn't a mistake. It's how awareness actually works. And once that becomes acceptable, something shifts. The gap no longer feels like something that needs to be corrected. It becomes something expected. And when it's expected, it doesn't trigger the same need for repetition, because nothing feels out of place. That doesn't mean the memories disappear completely. Some will still return. But when they do, they feel different, less urgent, less active, more like something passing through rather than something demanding attention. And over time, the mind begins to recognize that not every version of you needs to be updated. Some versions only need to be left where they are. That idea removes the pressure to constantly refine the past. It allows your timeline to exist as a sequence, not a problem to solve. And within that sequence, inconsistencies stop being threats. They become part of the structure. That's where the loop starts to lose its hold, not because you forced it to stop, but because it no longer has a purpose. And what replaces it isn't silence in the dramatic sense. It's something quieter, a kind of internal stillness that doesn't depend on fixing anything. A space where memory exists without demanding revision. A way of relating to yourself that doesn't require every version to meet the same standard. And from that place, something subtle changes in how you move forward. Less monitoring, less internal correction, less need to revisit what has already passed. Not because everything is resolved, but because it no longer needs to be. And that distinction changes more than it seems, because most of the pressure you feel around memory was never really about the past. It came from the expectation that everything unfinished must eventually become finished, that every unclear moment must be clarified, that every version of you must eventually align into one consistent identity. That expectation creates a kind of internal workload that never actually ends, because life doesn't produce perfectly closed experiences. It produces fragments, delays, partial understandings that only make sense later, sometimes much later, and often in ways that don't fully connect back to the original moment. So when the need for resolution begins to loosen, something unexpected happens. The mind doesn't become empty, but it becomes less occupied. Not because fewer thoughts exist, but because fewer thoughts are treated as tasks. That difference is subtle, but it's structural. A memory can appear without being assigned a purpose. It can pass through awareness without triggering analysis, correction, or comparison. At first, this feels unfamiliar, almost like neglect, because the habit of engaging with every returning memory runs deep. When something resurfaces, the instinct is to do something with it, to extract meaning, to refine it, to position it correctly within your understanding of yourself. But when that instinct is not followed, the memory doesn't disappear immediately. It lingers for a moment, waiting for interaction, waiting for the usual process to begin. And when that process doesn't start, the memory behaves differently. It doesn't intensify. It doesn't demand attention. It simply loses direction. Without engagement, it has nowhere to go. That's the part that often gets overlooked. The loop was never sustained by the memory itself. It was sustained by your participation in it. Not in an obvious way, not intentionally, but through the consistent act of returning to it with the expectation that something must be done. So when that expectation is removed, the loop doesn't break with force. It fades through disuse. And this fading doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't come with a clear moment where everything stops. It happens gradually, almost quietly, in a way that's easy to miss if you're looking for something more defined. You might notice that a memory still appears, but it no longer pulls you into it. The emotional tone softens, not because the meaning changed, but because the role it played in your mind has shifted. It's no longer something you work on. It's something you pass by. That change creates a different kind of internal environment, one where not everything needs to be processed immediately or even eventually, where some experiences are allowed to remain incomplete without being treated as problems. And within that environment, your relationship with time begins to feel less compressed. Because when every moment is expected to be fully understood, time feels dense. It feels like something that must be constantly interpreted, constantly organized. But when that expectation loosens, time becomes more open. Moments can exist without being finalized. They can remain as they were, without needing to be re-entered. This doesn't make you passive. It doesn't reduce awareness. It simply changes how awareness behaves. Instead of moving backward to adjust what has already happened, it stays aligned with what is happening now. And that alignment reduces the need for correction later. Not completely, but enough. Enough to create space. And that space has its own effect. Because when the mind is no longer occupied with revisiting and refining the past, it doesn't rush to fill that space immediately. It rests in it briefly, without direction. And that brief pause carries a different kind of clarity, one that isn't built through analysis, but through absence of interference. In that clarity, something becomes easier to see, not the details of past moments, but the pattern that connected them. The way attention moved, the way awareness arrived late, the way expectation followed after. And seeing that pattern without trying to fix it changes how it continues. Because patterns that are observed without resistance don't need to repeat with the same intensity. They lose some of their structure, some of their momentum, simply by not being reinforced in the usual way. This doesn't mean you stop learning from past experiences. It means learning no longer requires replay. It happens more directly, more quietly, without needing to revisit the exact moment where something wasn't understood. And that shift makes future moments feel different. Not easier in the sense of perfection, but less burdened by the expectation of immediate clarity. You respond with what you know, without assuming that it must be complete. And when understanding arrives later, it doesn't trigger the same loop, because it's no longer treated as something that needs to be inserted back into the past. It remains in the present. That's what changes the direction. Instead of constantly moving backward to correct, awareness stays where it is and integrates forward. And over time, that forward movement becomes more stable than the backward pull. But this stability doesn't come from effort. It comes from the absence of a certain kind of pressure, the pressure to make everything make sense immediately, the pressure to ensure that every version of you aligns with the current one, the pressure to treat every delay in understanding as something that needs to be resolved. Without that pressure, the mind reorganizes on its own, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to create a different baseline, a baseline where not every thought becomes a loop, where not every memory becomes a task, where not every version of you becomes a problem to fix. And within that baseline, something else begins to settle, a quieter form of trust. Not trust that everything will always make sense, but trust that it doesn't have to. That meaning can exist without being fully extracted, that understanding can arrive without needing to be applied retroactively, that the timeline of your life doesn't require constant revision to remain valid. That kind of trust doesn't remove uncertainty. It changes your position relative to it. Instead of trying to reduce it, you allow it. And allowing it reduces the need for control, which, in turn, reduces the need for repetition. Because repetition was never just about memory. It was about maintaining control over something that had already passed. And once that control is no longer required, the mechanism that sustained it begins to lose relevance. Not all at once, but steadily. And as it loses relevance, something else becomes more noticeable. The present moment, not as something to manage or optimize, but as something that doesn't need to be completed in real time. A moment can remain partially understood without becoming a future loop. It can pass without leaving behind the same kind of open structure that used to demand attention later. That changes how you move through things. Less anticipation of correction, less awareness of potential mistakes, less monitoring of how each moment might be judged later. And without that layer of monitoring, your attention becomes more direct. Not sharper in an intense way, but clearer in a quiet way. You're less divided between the experience and the evaluation of the experience, which reduces the delay, not entirely, but enough to shift the pattern. Because when the gap between experience and understanding becomes smaller, even slightly, fewer moments remain open. Fewer memories return with the same persistence, and the ones that do return no longer carry the same weight, because they aren't being approached with the same expectation. They aren't being asked to resolve anything. They're allowed to exist and pass. And that allowance changes how memory behaves overall. It becomes less active, less structured, less repetitive. Not because it's been controlled, but because it's no longer being organized around the need for correction. It returns when it returns, fades when it fades, without being held in place by ongoing attention. That creates a different rhythm, one that isn't driven by unfinished processes, but by natural movement. Moments arise, moments pass. Some leave impressions, some don't, and none of them are required to complete themselves in order for you to move forward. That realization isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive as a sudden shift. It builds gradually through repeated experiences of not engaging, not correcting, not returning in the same way. And over time, that becomes the default. Not because you forced it, but because the alternative stopped feeling necessary. And when it stops feeling necessary, it stops happening with the same intensity. That's the quiet change. Not a solution in the usual sense, not a technique to apply, just a different way of relating to what has already happened, a way that doesn't rely on resolution to create stillness. And from that place, the mind doesn't need to keep going back. It has somewhere else to stay. If any part of this felt familiar, stay with that feeling a little longer. Not to analyze it, not to turn it into another loop, but just to notice it without interference. Sometimes that quiet observation does more than any attempt to fix it ever could.